This is going to be probably the most important episode we ever do. The number one killer of these engines. It causes a catastrophic failure. And here's the thing, it's preventable. If I do my job well in this episode and we're able to get this out and enough people see it, I guarantee you we can cut our engine sales and rebuilds in half. And it's something that's been on my mind for a year or two now, but as we've collected more and more data and become more and more sure about what we know, I feel like now's probably the best time and the right time, and so I'm excited about it.
Welcome back to episode 3 of the podcast. Today I have always the special guest, Brandon. Brandon, how are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for asking.
How are you feeling gearing up for this new episode?
I'm a little bit nervous. This is going to be probably the most important episode we ever do. And it's something that's been on my mind for a year or two now. But as we've collected more and more data and become more and more sure about what we know, I feel like now's probably the best time and the right time. And so I'm excited about it.
Perfect. I'm excited too. So if you're watching, please gear up, put your seatbelts on. It's going to be a good episode. But before we get into it, I do just want to drop an exclusive hint. On our website, we are now selling merch. So if you do want to go on there and find a shirt, find a hat, you can find it there. So definitely go check that out. Brandon, are you ready for the first question?
Let's dive in.
Let's dive in. The first question we received, this one is from an email inquiry. We got this from Tom Fitch. Thank you for sending in the question. He asks, or he says, I like my 3.6 and would prefer to stick with a 3.6. Can this be achieved at your shop with good success?
Yes, absolutely. And so stock upgrades, whether for a spec racing class or just because someone wants to keep what they have, I still have a stock 3.6 in my 996.2. Partially because we haven't had time to get it on the schedule, and partially because I love it. It's just very fun for driving on the street. It's all the power I need to dart around and do what I need to do. It's very functional, and it makes me smile. So
that's good to know. I'm sure he isn't the only one that just wants to keep it where it's at and not want to go to 4.1. So,
yeah. And since we're milling out the old cylinders and dropping in complete cylinder replacements, it's as easy for us to do a 3.6 as a 4.1 build. And so there's not a lot of difference. There's a few differences in how we approach it, but generally it's the same. That's why a lot of or good percentage of our builds are capacity upgrades, because one, why not? But also two, I do believe that it helps the resale value and also the enjoyment factor a little bit. And, especially like the 3.8 to 4.1 upgrade, for instance, is, the percentage-wise, that's probably our smallest upgrade. However, it just gives it makes it feel effortless and makes everything a little easier, and just makes it feel like, the way the car might have should have come from Porsche in the first place. So
perfect. That's a good answer for a good question. All right, let's move into question number 2. This one comes from Alidi Hay, and it asks, I'd like to know what aftermarket oiling systems or components can improve lubrication and how they are applied, such as pumps, sumps, larger capacity oil pans, etc. Also, water cooling system improvements. Maybe fuel also to prevent starvation. Anything that can keep the engine healthy in high G environments. Thanks.
That's a great question, and it leads us right into what is really the number one killer of these engines. And it doesn't just cause a failure, it causes a catastrophic failure. And here's the thing, it's preventable. If I do my job well in this episode and we're able to get this out and enough people see it, I guarantee you we can cut our engine sales and rebuilds in half. And how awesome would that be if every build we did wasn't because somebody had to, but was a proactive build for more power or longevity or racing or whatever the reason might be, smoother, less to worry about, and wasn't because their engine had literally torn itself apart.
In a perfect world.
In a perfect world. So here we go. All right. So diving in, the number one cause of failures in 996, 986, 997, and 987, 99 through '08 Porsche engines that we see are spun rod bearings due to oil starvation. I think a lot of this goes back to the original oil recommendation for these engines. And so we've seen the proper oil is a big component of it. Another part of the equation is the oil fill level. I think a lot of times as the older engines start using more oil, people aren't maybe paying enough attention to the oil level. And as it gets lower and lower, we know that increases the susceptibility to oil starvation. The other component that can play a factor, especially if using a thinner oil, is too much heat in the engine. But before we get into the solution, let's dive into more of what is a rod bearing? What do they do? What's their purpose? And what does a spun rod bearing even mean? So we've got more show and tell today. Also, there was a request by PV997 on RenList for more quantifiable evidence. So we're going to dive into data off of race cars that were literally competing in events and see not only what does the bad data look like, but what does the good data look like, and how we are solving that. So going to be lots of fun, interesting technical stuff. And so here we go.
Let's get into it.
All right. So to start with, it's important to understand what is a rod bearing and what does it do. So this is the connecting rod, and the connecting rod essentially connects the piston to the crankshaft. Now, as we know, the piston is what moves up and down in our bore, and it's a 4-stroke cycle. So the piston moves down and sucks in air. The piston moves back up the bore and compresses it. There's a spark and a flame event that pushes the piston down. That's the power stroke. And then the piston pushes back up and expels the gases out of the cylinder. And this happens by this crankshaft as it turns. Yeah. So it will take the piston down and back up, creating that motion and those events. Now then, in order for this to happen, there is a rod journal on the crank, and there is a bearing that goes on this journal to allow the rod to move freely. And then we've got oil galleries right here that feed oil to this rod bearing to allow it to glide across this journal. Now then, when we talk about a spun rod bearing, so let's look at that bearing. Now this is a fairly used but somewhat healthy bearing. And if you look, there's little tangs in here. I say that, it doesn't fit super great. There's little tangs that hold this bearing in place. Now then, when there is a lack of oil, it will cause this bearing to actually spin in here, and that notch is no longer where it needs to be, and it causes pressure between the bearing and the journal, or between the rod and the journal. And so as that bearing spins around like this and gets pressed against this journal, it starts heating up. And the more it heats up, the more friction, the hotter it gets, until it eventually will weld itself to this bearing. Now then, it eventually gets hot enough that it will weld itself to this journal. Now this particular crank was from a spec Cayman race engine. The gentleman was in his very first race. He was all excited, and sure enough, he had an engine failure, spun rod bearing. You can see this bearing. This is what used to be the bearing. This is what the journal looks like. This is what it looks like with a bearing welded to it. And so once this bearing welds to this crank, it inevitably causes the rod to fail. This is not the fault of the rod. It's not the fault of the rod bolts. It is 100% an issue with the bearing. And then once this rod fails, while the crank is still spinning, it starts beating the heck out of everything. And so you can see this crank carrier, for instance, still has a piece of the rods stuck in it. That's lodged there pretty good. You can see this crank carrier here. The other half of this crank carrier has the side of it completely blown out. We see pieces of cylinder that have been trashed and knocked out. It truly is a catastrophic event that does a lot of damage to the engine. And so that's why understanding the issue and how to correct it is so important for helping these engines stay alive and keep going. This crank is probably capable of 5, 6, I don't know, 800,000 miles. We've seen them with a couple 100,000 miles on them, and they look as good as they did brand new. And so same thing with these carriers. And then even with the cases, once we get done with them, we've talked about some of the things that we need to, the flaws that we need to fix in those, but really the crank carrier and the crank itself are very robust and reliable as long as they're properly oiled. Here's a few more rod bearings off of engines. And we talked last time a little bit about oil analysis and why it's important. And so these are tri-metal bearings, and you can see that on these that are worn down, this one's actually chipped off and is pretty close to spinning. And when it gets down to the copper layer of that third layer and starts shedding copper, that's what it looks like when you tear it apart. And that's why we're always mindful if we're seeing high amounts of copper relative to the other metals in an oil analysis. It is really the number one thing we're looking for on an ongoing basis. If there is copper in there, I'm not saying it's that it's too late, but it definitely warrants max protection on the oil side and taking really good care of the engine to keep it from degrading any further. At least in a street engine, in a race engine, it's probably a good time to rebuild.
So this is the bad guy.
Yes, this is the killer. And so this is essentially when you hear rod knock, it's because the rod bearing has spun, the rod has failed, and is literally beating up the engine every time the crank turns around. So next we're going to go into the oiling system a little bit and how it works in what's called an integrated wet sump on these, but essentially is pretty much a dry sump. So we've got two different types of oil pan from the factory. One is an X51 with a little nicer baffle that is meant to try and help with the oiling issue. The other is just a stock plastic baffle. Now then, this is the oil pickup. It's got a little screen to shield debris from going through there. And that goes here and gets sucked up into the engine like so. And then it's going to come in, and first place it's going to go is to the front of the engine on the console to the oil pump. Now then, the oil pump is going to pump it up through the filter into the oil cooler, and then it gets sent down to the crank carrier where we saw the crank a little bit ago, and through that it gets dispersed to the crank and to the main bearing crank journals and to the rod journals. It also goes through the head bolts, which is a little bit interesting about these engines. The head bolts are also the oil passages to the heads, and then it goes up to the heads where it lubricates the camshafts and the valve springs and valves and the entire valve train as well. Also the variocam actuators and those sort of things. And then as that's happening, it then drains back down and goes back down into the sump. Now then, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. So the oil that goes to the crank carrier and the crank and the rods, that essentially just drops down into the pan, and so there's no issues there. But the oil that is used in the heads, and here you can see we've got the valve springs, and this is where the camshafts go across here. This oil drains down here, holds like that, and then comes down to this area to a scavenge pump. And so what that looks like is, here's your scavenge pump. And if I pull this off, it's a pretty simple but effective little pumping mechanism. And it's got essentially an in and an out on it. A little bit fiddly. There goes the screen. This is an extra one. And so this fits right here. As this scavenge pump turns, it's going to pick the oil up here, push it through the head into the case half, and then essentially it's going to go through this chamber, these chambers here, into this drain back tube. Now then, there's two types of drain back tube. This is the 997 drain back tube. This is the early 996 swirl pot. And so what we've seen from the data early on was that this does not return the oil to the heads quick enough. And so we do not recommend this. If we get an engine in with this older style swirl pot, we always swap it out to the 997 drain backs. And so instead of trying to de-aerate the oil with the swirl pot, it essentially flows it onto the cylinder or onto the sump wall and then drains it down that way to try and keep it from splashing and creating more aeration. Now then, one of the biggest myths about oil starvation is that it only happens on race tires. And that is a myth, because if you think about it, not only have we seen plenty of failures that happened with street tires, but 1G of lateral force, which can easily be done on street tires, is enough to cause the oil to be at a 45-degree angle. So if you think about that, instead of lying flat in the sump, it would now be approximately from this corner up to this corner, depending on how much it was there. With slicks, we will see it up to 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 Gs, depending on the slicks and the setup of the race car. But getting 0.9 Gs to 1 G is enough to cause the issue. So under normal circumstances, there's plenty of slope here for the oil to gravity feed back down to where it's picked up by the sump. Now then, if you think of a turn at 1G and the oil at 45 degrees, that's going to cause all of that oil, instead of draining down, to get pushed up to this side of the head. So if you think about a braking event where all of the oil gets pushed to the back and isn't able to flow forward, then that does not allow it to gravity feed back to the pump necessarily while braking. And then if you think about after braking and pushing all the oil back to this side of the sump, then once you go into a turn at 0.8, 0.9, 1 G on street tires, or even more on slicks, then that same oil gets pushed against the head or against the valve cover and gets trapped up here and isn't allowed to return immediately. That means the sump gets low on oil and it inevitably starts sucking air. And when that air starts going through the system, that's when we start seeing the periods of oil starvation.
No good.
No good. That's bad. So now that we've seen what the rod bearings do, how they fail, what it means to spin, what the cause of it is due to the oiling system, let's talk about how to cure it.
Let's talk about it.
Ricardo, any questions about that? I know sometimes I get a little technical and it's not always clear to the average viewer of the show, but wanting to at least provide some visualization of how this situation takes place.
No, I think you covered it fairly thoroughly. And like I said, it helps so much having the visual representation. So no.
Okay. All right. So this is what it looks like on the data. And so this was a car that is a race car. And on its first outing with a 3.4 spec Cayman engine, there was a little bit of confusion, and they were running a popular 2-quart deep sump with Mobil 15W50 oil. Now then, Mobil 15W50 M1 used to be kind of a go-to race oil back in the day. And it even said race oil on it to an extent. However, they have since changed the formulation quite a bit, and we no longer recommend use of that oil. We've seen, even on the street, we've had multiple used oil analysis come back from customers that just didn't look as good as what we're used to seeing, and we had asked them to switch what the oil that they were using. In one case, even asked them to please change immediately. And sure enough, every time we've changed, we've seen that oil analysis clear up and the problems go away. And so this race car was using M1 15W50 with a popular 2-quart deep sump. And here's what we're looking at. And so this top trace is RPM. And as you can see, pretty much all through here, except for this one event, which I've asked it to highlight, it's above 3,000 RPMs. Now then, down here, on the other hand, you can see that while the average oil pressure declines, and we've seen this as part of being a 40-weight oil, as those oils heat up, the viscosity gets lower and the pump can't pump it as efficiently. It can seep through the bearing clearances much quicker. And so we lose overall system oil pressure. But also, if you look down here, this is 20 PSI and this is 10 PSI. And we have multiple locations where RPM is not dropping below 3,000, but oil pressure is dropping below 20, below 15. And this one even gets down to, we can dive it a little bit deeper. And so here we're seeing oil pressure of 10 PSI at 4,400 RPM. This is the scenario where rod bearings spin.
This is where the fireworks happen.
This is bad. Even to the point that specifically in the Spec Cayman race class, I know of shops that were going to 70-hour rebuilds because these engines were popping so frequently on them because of this. We saw this data and we asked them, one, can we get the engine back in to take a look? And they said, no, we have a race next weekend. And so we overnighted them a Hartec deep sump. And I'm not saying this is the only way to cure the problem, but it is a way that we have figured out how to cure the problem. So we also asked them to switch to Motul 300V 10W60 to go ahead and change the oil, fill it up to the max fill line, start it to make sure the oil worked all the way through the system, and then let it sit overnight. And the reason is because there is a timer on the instrument cluster where it is performing a calculation to tell you how much oil is there. And so the bars you see on the graph is a calculation based on the temperature of the oil and also how long it's been since the engine was last run. And so by allowing it to sit overnight, we're getting an actual amount of oil in there at essentially room temperature, if you will, and it's relying less on that calculation. And so we asked them to measure it the next day, top it off to the max fill line, and run 1 extra quart. And so it was max fill line plus a quart. Now then, this particular engine has a Motorsport AOS on it. We've also had good luck with the UAOS, which is a popular item these days. And so those are 2 recommendations for track use and overfill. But generally, for the average person, just making sure it doesn't go below the max fill line is typically enough to operate the vehicle safely on streets, even when driven aggressively. But we would rather see the engine a half quart overfilled than a half quart underfilled any day of the week. Now then, let's dive back in and see what the data looks like with that. So here is the data from the next race. And as you can see, there are multiple instances where RPM drops, goes back up, but oil pressure, the only time we see oil pressure go below 40 even is when RPM drops as well. So no other location do we see oil pressure coming down below.
It's a lot cleaner of a graph, and it doesn't decline
Right.
nearly as.
And so we're seeing static oil pressure staying stable throughout the race. And then we're seeing minimum oil pressure of about the closest thing we're seeing to a dip. Dive in a little bit deeper into here. And so this little bit of a dip is happening at 2,200 RPMs. We're seeing oil pressure of 48 PSI. So a dramatic difference.
Can't compare it, really.
So much so that the PCA chief steward actually pulled the data from this race, looked at all of the data to make sure there were no cheater engines in it, because they knew our engine was in the race. But then they also looked at the oil pressure data, because they'd been having so many problems with these engines, and ours was the only one that looked like this.
Oh, wow.
Every other engine had drops well down into the teens and even a few single digits into that. It's damaging the engine and will eventually spin the rod bearing and fail because of that. We've got more. This is the next race that they went to. Once again, a nice, consistent flat line up around 50, 55 PSI. This actually isn't the healthiest of oil pumps. We would like to see it a little higher than this. And so that is on the maintenance list for this car. However, even with that, we're not seeing any
abnormalities to the consistency that it's given us right now.
Exactly. And so this is a similar trace from another car of ours, same scenario, running the same setup. And so it's a little tougher to see here, but our static oil pressure or system oil pressure is up around 80, where we would expect to see it. And if you look, we don't really have any drops. A few, the biggest drop we see is down to about 60 PSI, where there's a few drops here, but where you can see there's an associated RPM event. And so once again, a very healthy, stable engine that has plenty of oil pressure to feed the bearings. One other example of this is we were commissioning a race engine out in California, and that engine had a Motec ECU on it. We were gathering a lot of data, and we wanted to see, okay, exactly how much oil do we need to run in this system? So it had a Motorsport AOS, once again, it had a Hartec deep sump, and so we filled it halfway between mid and max, and we sent it out on track, and we said, go do just a couple of laps. We know this isn't ideal. Let's see what we get back. And they brought it back in. We looked at the data, and sure enough, it was, we saw some significant drops. And so we added a half quart of oil, got it up to the max fill line, sent it back out. And this one, they didn't have the 10W60, so they were running the 15W50, which we see good results with, but not as good of results. And so they ran it. We still had some drops. We put in another half quart, rinsed and repeat. And at 1.5 quarts overfilled, we quit seeing drops of any significance. And so we saw that nice, stable oil pressure that we're looking for throughout the runs and the race, instead of using the oil level sensor to determine how much oil is getting trapped in the heads.
You're letting the car.
We used the oil pressure sensor and let the car tell us how much oil was getting trapped in the heads.
Fair.
I would say while the 15W50 is a good oil, that also helped us determine that the 10W60 is approximately equivalent to running an extra half quart of oil in the engine.
Can't argue with the numbers, can you?
Right? So in addition to recommending the 10W60 on track, we have multiple customers that are running either the 10W60 or the 15W50 300V oil on extended ranges, 3,000 to 4,000 miles. And so we're looking forward to seeing those oil reports back. We've had a few. Additive package still looks good. The viscosity looks great in them. The oxidation value is climbing up just a little bit on us, which is pretty typical for an ester-based oil. And so we're monitoring those to make sure that that doesn't become an issue at 4,000 and 5,000 miles. But for max protection of an engine, whether it's one of ours or whether it's stock engine, we are recommending the higher quality race oils. Another one that we like, not necessarily for aggressive driving, but for street driving, is either the liquid moly 5W50. We have a number of customers that are working with that, or Driven's DI50 is also another well-developed boutique type oil. And so those are our three recommendations right now. We do also support VR1, Valvoline VR1. They're full synthetic 15W50 or 20W50, not the conventional version. And that's only because that's one that can be picked up typically at a local auto parts store if you don't have time to get in a higher quality oil, but that's only kind of as a last resort. It's the Modal 300V, the liquid moly 5W50, or the DI50 are our three recommended oils. And then for track use, we only support the 300V. And if somebody puts a 40 weight oil in one of our engines, essentially that's a good way to avoid the warranty. We know through the data that they do not adequately protect the engine from failure, period. One more thing we'll get into is the Hartec Deep Sump, and can kind of show you that. This isn't so much as a sales pitch for one particular item over another. This is simply us testing and seeing what works. We've seen data from others on the UIDS, and we've seen pretty good looking data from it. However, we haven't done any testing with it ourselves, and the Hartec sump is the one that we recommend for all racing and dedicated track cars. And what makes it special is, one, it's fairly deep, but if you look at the passages on here, they're meant to channel the oil. So based on whether it's a 996, 997 or a 986, 987 is the orientation that this sump will be when it's braking. And so when it's braking, it's got these channels that fill up this reservoir with the oil and stack it here. And then when the car goes to turn, it's able to keep the oil in this. We use a stock baffle on top of it, like so. And then there is a spacer that has the pump pickup all the way down at the bottom. And so this is one of the keys for the setup that we have seen that's worked. It's very well designed, and we've had very good luck with it. The other key is keeping the oil cool. However, with the 10W60 in particular, it's meant to protect up to 260, 265 degrees Fahrenheit for the oil temperature without dropping below kind of that 11 to 12 centistroke mark, which is key for having our viscosity that we need to maintain the oil pressure under aggressive driving. And so while we do believe still in center radiators and upgraded radiators and anything that could be done for cooling, it's maybe not quite as critical for longevity if we're protecting the engine properly from the heat. Yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. There's a lot of research and testing and data, and this is something I've been working on for a couple of years. I even spent a couple of hundred hours down in my garage at Eagles Canyon with my Boxster testing different sumps and giving the data to others who were posting it as we kind of started working through this issue. And the first concept of overfilling to maintain pressure came from a Renlist community movement. And then we've since taken it from there, combined in the Hartech sump, and just all the data that we've seen on track from our customers as to what works and what doesn't, both through the data and the oil analysis, has shown us where, yes, we know that this is a solution. And if more people will take this seriously, I believe that we will see less engines in the long run from catastrophic failure due to oil starvation.
Wow, what a topic. What a topic.
Yes.
No wonder you're pretty excited about this one.
It's a big one.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. We don't have to include this. Is there any difference in the data from using from not using a regular stock one?
Yes, we have definitely seen the stock oil sump is the worst offender of the sumps that we've tested. We have seen improvements from using an X51 baffle. So a good percentage of our engines that go out that aren't going to see track or race conditions, we'll go ahead, and if they're going to be driving it aggressively, we do like to go ahead and put just the X51 baffle in it. We've got a version for $350, so it's not an expensive upgrade. But yes, for max protection, these two things have been the key for us on being able to guarantee and warranty our engines for track use.
The perfect Slakker recommended combo.
Yes.
Nice. Well, you did say you had a lot to show for this third episode, and you definitely delivered, and it was super informative. Hopefully they listen and take it in, because you definitely dropped a lot of knowledge bombs on this episode.
Yeah. And, hopefully we can do some follow-ups if need be, or some shorter versions. But I think it's just a really important message to get out and to help people understand how to protect their engines. I think that'll not only have less catastrophic failures, but we'll also see a rise in overall value of the 997s and 996s and 987s. And it can take the place in Porsche history that I believe it deserves.
Very well said. Is this where we close up?
I think that's probably enough information for one sitting.
Perfect. If you've gotten this far, we appreciate you for listening. Definitely drop more questions in there, because we do intend to answer as many as we can. Do you have any last words to close this out into the beautiful Oklahoma sunset?
Thanks everyone for joining us. Please continue to provide comments, questions, feedback. We want to continue to adapt this and get better. I do consider myself one of the last people to end up on YouTube. However, I've got a lot to share and a lot to say, and so this seems to be a really good format for doing it. But until then, drive hard, wrench smart, and see you on the next lap.